Welcome to Crisis and Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into what is arguably one of the most practically consequential works of political science of the late 20th century. That would be Gene Sharp's foundational text, From Dictatorship to Democracy, a conceptual framework for liberation. This is a book that has guided movements around the globe from the Baltic states to Southeast Asia.
It really has. It's almost an underground classic in some circles.
And the core question Sharp grapples with, and really the one we are tackling today, is just profound and urgent. How do these entrenched systems of authoritarian power persist? They seem so invulnerable. And more importantly, how can they be effectively dismantled without resorting to the immense, the human and structural costs of military conflict?
Which is the great puzzle, right? This is political science applied to real-world suffering.
Exactly.
And it is a supremely timely discussion. I mean, precisely because the framework Sharp established back in 1993, it's just truly timeless.
It's not a historical memoir.
No, not at all. He was trying to establish a systematic, almost a mechanical understanding of how political power is accumulated, how it's maintained through compliance.
And how it stops working.
And how it stops working when that compliance is strategically withdrawn.
So what we want to do today for you is a rigorous systems-level analysis. We are not interested in a partisan discussion about specific political figures or current events.
No, this is about the underlying architecture.
Exactly. We're looking analytically at the mechanisms. How is power gained, maintained, and most crucially, lost? We're examining the dynamics of compliance, of obedience, and the fundamental structural weaknesses that are just inherent in these centralized dictatorial systems.
The very things that make them brittle, despite their appearance of strength.
Yes, that's the word, brittle.
Sharp essentially provides the blueprint for understanding what he calls the Achilles heel of any dictatorship. And to really appreciate the utility of his framework, I think we have to first understand the man.
And the history that forged his ideas. So let's start there. Who is Gene Sharp and what was his mission?
Well, Gene Sharp, who held a DPhil from Oxford and was a professor emeritus of political science, he's really recognized worldwide as a key figure in the academic, but also the strategic study of nonviolent action.
And his work, as you said, wasn't done in an ivory tower. It was intensely practical.
Oh, absolutely. It was driven by this deep historical concern with the nature of totalitarian power.
That concern, as the book's preface explains, was forged by his extensive studies of some of the most brutal regimes. We're talking the Nazi and Stalinist systems.
Yeah, he spent years reading, studying, and this is the important part, speaking with survivors.
So this is direct lived experience informing the theory.
Exactly. He spoke with Norwegians who survived fascist rule, with Jewish survivors who escaped the Holocaust, and later he consulted with activists who had lived under oppressive regimes in places like Panama, Poland, Chile, Tibet, Burma.
So his scholarship was a direct, pragmatic response to palpable terror.
And to the perceived need for a viable alternative to armed resistance. I mean, his central question was always, if violence is a trap, what is the systematic operational path to freedom?
And his solution wasn't just to write a book. His work actually culminated in the establishment of the Albert Einstein Institution in Boston.
Right, and the name itself tells you something about the ambition: to apply systematic, almost scientific thinking to the problem of political conflict.
So what's the institution's mission?
It's very clear and focused. It's to advance the strategic use of nonviolent action globally, to defend democratic freedoms, oppose oppression, dictatorship, genocide.
And fundamentally to reduce our reliance on violence as an instrument of policy.
Exactly. They actively engage in research, they share their results publicly, and they consult with groups facing real-time conflicts.
I find that remarkable, to take decades of meticulous historical and political analysis and then turn it into what amounts to an operating manual for change.
That's a great way to put it.
And the book itself, From Dictatorship to Democracy, reflects that operational focus perfectly. I mean, it wasn't written for a university press initially, was it?
No, not at all. It was originally published in Bangkok in 1993. It was specifically requested by and distributed to the Committee for the Restoration of Democracy in Burma.
Who were fighting a ruthless military junta at the time.
Right. The need was immediate, it was strategic, it was practical. And since then, it's been translated into dozens of languages and distributed in conflict zones globally, which just shows its utility in incredibly diverse contexts, from Serbia's Otpor to movements in Ukraine and Egypt.
And the context for its writing is so crucial. This was right after the successful, predominantly nonviolent defiance that saw the collapse of dictatorships in the late 80s and early 90s.
Right, we're talking about Eastern Europe, Lithuania, the Philippines People Power Revolution.
Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution.
Exactly. So Sharp was synthesizing the principles of those successful transitions. He was moving them past this idea of a spontaneous, moral action toward calculated strategic planning.
Which brings us to the central thesis, the real aha moment for anyone coming to this work for the first time.
It's a thesis that is beautifully simple but just revolutionary in its implications.
And it is.
That dictatorships are not permanent, immovable objects sustained solely by military might. They rely primarily on internal factors, specifically the assistance, the submission, and the cooperation of the population and the institutions of that society.
So political power is inherently relational. It's contingent, not absolute.
Precisely. It is entirely contingent. And so liberation is possible when the population intentionally and strategically withdraws that consent.
Often through highly disciplined nonviolent action.
Right. By severing the sources of power, the people literally starve the regime of what it needs to function. And Sharp frames this not as a moral or religious plea.
No, it's a practical exercise in political mechanics.
Yes, exactly. It's akin to disabling a massive engine by simply cutting its fuel lines.
Okay, let's unpack this political mechanics framework, and I think we should start by understanding the routes that Sharp rejects.
Yes, that's crucial because it sets the stage for why nonviolent struggle, or what he terms political defiance, is presented as the superior, most reliable strategy.
Right, for achieving durable democracy, not just a change in leadership.
The first core insight addresses the sheer inadequacy of conventional violent conflict. Sharp argues that dissidents, by choosing violence or military rebellion, are making a fundamental strategic error.
And that error is?
They're choosing to fight the dictator on the field where the dictator is strongest.
That's insight one. Fighting where the dictator has overwhelming superiority. Dictatorships nearly always possess overwhelming superiority in military hardware, in training, size, communication.
Everything. So violent rebellions in this context usually lead to brutal, immediate repression, immense casualties, and an increased sense of helplessness among the populace. The cost is immense, and it's predictable.
And we have to look beyond just the immediate failure rate. Sharp emphasizes the structural damage of even successful violent efforts, like prolonged guerrilla warfare.
That's a key point. Guerrilla struggles rarely usher in durable democracy. They typically lead to immense casualties, displacement, and, crucially, the new regime often becomes more dictatorial than its predecessor.
Why? What is the systemic mechanism at work there?
It's because the prolonged military struggle requires the constant expansion and centralization of armed forces. The independent civil groups, the labor unions, the schools, churches, media, which are the essential building blocks of democracy,
They'll get wiped out.
they're either co-opted, militarized, or just destroyed by the conflict. So you fought for freedom, but you created the structural conditions for the next regime to be just as centralized, militarized, and intolerant of independent thought as the last one.
It's a systemic paradox of violence.
This is.
And coup d'etat. Sharp is equally dismissive of those.
Well, a coup is just swapping one centralized clique for another. It leaves the existing maldistribution of power completely intact.
The population remains passive, civil society is still weak.
And the result is frequently just a more ruthless regime seizing the same levers of power.
Okay, so that's the problem with violence. The second major insight is what he calls the illusion of external salvation.
Right. You often hear arguments that international bodies or powerful nations must intervene to save an oppressed population. Sharp is brutally realistic here.
How so?
He emphasizes that relying on foreign saviors, the UN, powerful states, or international sanctions alone is often just misplaced confidence. Foreign states frequently tolerate, ignore, or even actively assist dictators.
When it advances their own interests.
Of course. Their own economic, geopolitical, or resource interests. Self-interest, not humanitarianism, is what drives global policy.
So this forces a crucial conclusion. External intervention is only useful if and when internal resistance is already powerful enough.
Right. Powerful enough to expose the regime's brutality and focus international attention, making the cost of supporting the tyrant too high for outside powers.
The root of the dictatorship is internal, so the remedy has to be primarily internal.
Exactly. Sharp quotes the Irish leader Charles Stewart Parnell, who said, "You must only rely upon your own determination, no political action, No amount of sympathy will avail to release you from your thraldom if you yourselves do not determine to be free.
Self-reliance is the necessary foundation.
It has to be.
So Insight 3 hits hard against one of the most common public hopes, the danger of negotiations. People assume that if they can just get the dictator to the table, reason will prevail.
And Shop rejects this as fundamentally flawed, especially when fundamental issues like political freedom and the continued existence of the dictatorship are at stake.
You can't compromise on basic human rights.
No. You cannot negotiate a partial surrender of sovereignty over your own body or your own mind. It's impossible.
And this is where the analytical focus on power capacity really matters. In negotiations, the outcome isn't determined by justice or morality.
No, it's determined entirely by the relative power capacity of each side. It's a power calculation.
So if the opposition is weak, relying on hope and good faith,
Then negotiations are functionally a negotiated surrender. The dictator gains a massive amount of political capital by simply agreeing to show up.
how does just showing up give the dictator power? What's the mechanism there?
It grants legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. The dictator desperately wants to be treated as a normal head of state.
Right.
That's simple recognition. Shaking hands at a global summit, that is a critical source of political power. And what's more, dictators frequently use negotiations to induce the opposition to halt resistance.
Claiming a peace process is underway.
Exactly. And then they use that pause to identify, isolate, and eliminate key resistance leaders, paving the way for increased oppression later. It's often a political trap.
A trap designed to buy time and weaken the opposition's morale. So if violence is structurally damaging, foreign intervention is unreliable, and negotiations are a dangerous trap. Where does the leverage come from?
And that leads us to Insight 4.
Where power really comes from.
The fundamental vulnerability of all centralized rule. He illustrates this beautifully with a 14th century Chinese parable by Lu Ji, the Monkey Master fable.
I remember this one. The story describes an old man, the monkey master, who rules over a large group of monkeys.
And he forces them to submit by trickery, and by the monkey's own lack of enlightenment, they submit because they believe they must give him a tenth of their collected fruit.
And that they are incapable of collecting it themselves. They live in this perpetual shortage because they don't know their own power.
Right. And the tipping point occurs when a small monkey asks a simple question. Did the old man plant all the fruit trees and bushes?
And when the monkeys realize, no, they grew naturally and we collect them, the whole system collapses.
The whole thing. They tear down the stockade and leave. The master starves.
The parable's lesson for systems analysis is profound. The old man rules by trickery, not by righteous principle or superior force.
And as soon as the people become enlightened about the true source of power, the tricks just don't work anymore. The political mechanism is laid bare.
Political power, even in the most totalitarian systems, is derived from, and is therefore vulnerable to, the assistance, compliance, and obedience of the people.
And the institutions they operate.
This moves us into Insight 5, the core mechanism of the system's vulnerability. The 6 necessary sources of political power. The very things the populace can strategically restrict or sever.
Yes, this is the structural vulnerability of the dictator. Sharp argues that any ruler, especially a dictator, needs these 6 sources constantly replenished to function. If you can strategically restrict enough of them, the system becomes inoperable.
Let's dedicate some time to these because these are the operational targets for any resistance movement. First, there is authority.
And authority is the belief among the people, the military, the police, the bureaucracy, the general population, that the regime is legitimate.
That they have a moral duty to obey it.
Exactly. It's the psychological glue holding the system together. So targeting authority means acts of symbolic repudiation, public displays of contempt, things that signal to the population that the ruler is not deserving of respect or obedience.
Like symbolic funerals for resistance heroes or refusing to use state-sanctioned titles.
Yes. All of those. The second source is human resources.
This is just the sheer number and importance of the people who are obeying, cooperating, or providing assistance.
Right. The civil servants, administrators, police, military. If key personnel resign or go on strike or simply refuse to perform critical tasks, the administrative apparatus is gravely affected.
You can imagine a country where all the air traffic controllers, even if they stay in their jobs, suddenly adopt a working-to-rule slowdown.
And paralyze the entire system just by performing only the most basic written tasks at the slowest legal speed. That is the strategic restriction of human resources.
Without outright violence. Third, skills and knowledge.
The regime needs specialized experts, engineers, financial analysts, technicians, communicators. They need them to function efficiently.
And if these cooperating experts withdraw their specialized skills,
The dictatorship's capacity to implement complex policy or maintain critical infrastructure is just severely weakened.
a great example would be the refusal of state-owned media technicians or journalists to broadcast official propaganda.
Or university professors refusing to teach the regime's mandated ideology. The regime is left with the capacity for brute force, but it loses the capacity for sophisticated governance.
Fourth, intangible factors. What does he mean by that?
This refers to the psychological and cultural elements that induce obedience. Things like ideology or patriotism that's been warped to support the regime, cultural habits of deference.
Or, most importantly, the psychological factor of fear.
Yes, and the population's lack of self-confidence that breeds resistance. This is where symbolic acts gain tremendous power. A single act of public defiance that goes unpunished. It chips away at that collective habit of obedience.
When a large crowd sings a forbidden national anthem or openly celebrates a banned holiday.
They are publicly denying the intangible right of the regime to control their internal life. And that builds collective confidence and destroys fear.
Fifth is material resources. This is more straightforward.
Right. This covers control over property, natural resources, financial resources, the economic system, communication, transportation. Strikes and economic boycotts are direct attacks on this source.
We see this in mass consumer boycotts or the creation of parallel markets.
Exactly. If the population refuses to buy state-controlled goods, the financial structure supporting the dictatorship dries up. If banks refuse to process government transactions, or if labor unions stop the flow of key exports.
The regime loses the economic fuel it needs to pay its police and military.
Which brings us to the final source, the ultimate foundation of the dictatorial system, sanctions.
These are the threatened or applied punishments: imprisonment, torture, execution against the disobedient.
But critically, Sharp argues that sanctions lose their effectiveness entirely if defiance is widespread.
And if the population is willing to risk serious consequences collectively.
Yes. If 1,000 people are willing to be arrested, the dictator can handle it. If 100,000 people are performing acts of defiance daily, the state's capacity to apply sanctions just breaks down.
It physically runs out of prisons and police and bureaucratic energy.
The crucial takeaway is that all these sources, from moral authority to the brute force of sanctions, depend on cooperation and obedience. If you withdraw that cooperation, you diminish and may eventually sever the supply lines of power.
And the dictator's power will die, slowly or rapidly, from political starvation.
That realization is the bridge from political theory to systematic strategy.
So if power is contingent, the struggle is about strategically severing those 6 sources. Let's move now to the systems mapping. Let's analyze the structure and mechanisms of authoritarian stability and collapse through this lens.
Okay, so to map this system, we can identify 3 main groups of actors and their specific, often conflicting incentives.
First up, the dictator and the inner clique.
Their incentives are purely centered on maintaining power, position, wealth, and often an ideological vision of national control. Their sole drive is to maintain the flow of those 6 sources of power from society into their hands.
Second, you have the cooperating elite. The military commanders, police, bureaucracy, state-aligned media, and business leaders.
And their incentives are driven by a mix of factors. Self-preservation, through fear of punishment, career advancement, maybe a perceived sense of stability. But critically, their primary day-to-day incentive is reliable obedience.
Because their survival depends on it.
Their professional and physical survival. They are the conduits, and fear is their regulator.
And third, the population.
The masses. Incentivized by fear, the sheer habit of obedience instilled over years or decades, and a lack of knowledge or confidence in alternatives. Sharp notes that stability relies heavily on the population being atomized.
Turned into isolated, self-interested individuals.
Yes, and lacking the collective confidence necessary for strategic resistance.
So the dictator's power rests on this psychological foundation of atomization and fear, supported by an infrastructure of elites driven by self-preservation. But Sharp argues this entire edifice is built on narratives and assumptions that can be challenged.
Yes, and that brings us to the fundamental Achilles heel.
The major narrative to challenge is the one that dictators rely on most. That the government's power rests entirely on its overwhelming military strength and the threat of sanctions.
When the reality is that its strength rests on compliance, which is voluntary. Sharp actually identifies 17 inherent weaknesses in dictatorships. These are structural issues that make the system inherently fragile.
Despite the external appearance of strength.
Exactly. They aren't moral failings, they are bureaucratic and political malfunctions that are just endemic to highly centralized power.
Let's explore a couple of those because they show why centralization is often so inefficient. One key weakness is the problem of inaccurate information flow.
Oh, this is a classic systemic failure of fear. Subordinates are often so fearful of displeasing their superiors or the dictator that they don't report accurate or complete information.
So provincial governor whose region is riddled with unrest, he just reports minor incidents at the capital because he's terrified of being labeled weak.
Right. And if the dictator believes the province is 90% compliant when it's actually 40% in rebellion, their strategic policy decisions are fundamentally flawed.
They base policy and force deployment on profoundly misleading data.
Which leads to profound mistakes of judgment and action. Another weakness is internal conflicts and institutional rivalries.
Centralized power encourages a zero-sum game among underlings.
Of course, military generals, secret police chiefs, cabinet members, all competing for the dictator's favor. And this rivalry prevents coordinated action and creates massive systemic friction.
So if the police force is trying to arrest activists, but the military intelligence wing is suspicious of the police chief and refuses to share intelligence, the efficiency of repression just plummets.
Which means the perceived invulnerability is a myth. The system is internally unstable.
And it persists by maintaining a dangerous set of feedback loops that reinforce stability. This is the status quo mechanism in action.
And it's built entirely on fear and compliance. The loop starts with repression and threats, which feeds into fear and submission from the population.
This submission ensures the population provides the necessary sources of power, labor, skills, taxes, obedience.
Which the dictator then uses to enforce more rules and violence, his sanctions, which leads to increased repression and fear.
It's a perfect self-sustaining circle of tyranny.
It is.
So the question is, how do you successfully interrupt that self-sustaining cycle of fear?
And that's where nonviolent struggle comes in. It's the mechanism uniquely designed to disrupt it at its most critical point, the supply of the 6 sources of power.
Which brings us to the mechanisms of change.
Right. Political defiance is uniquely suited to severing those sources, making it difficult for the regime to combat, and at the same time aggravating its inherent weaknesses, like those internal rivalries we just discussed. Sharp identifies 4 primary mechanisms by which this happens.
4 mechanisms of change, ranging from the least likely to the most common path to liberation. Number 1 is conversion.
This is the least reliable path. It happens when the opponent, a general, a police officer, or even the dictator, is emotionally moved by the suffering of courageous, disciplined resistors, or rationally persuaded that the resistors' cause is just.
Powerful when it happens, but you can't base a national strategy on waiting for the moral awakening of your oppressors.
You can't. Number 2 is accommodation.
This is where a compromise is reached, but only on limited, non-fundamental issues.
Like raising the minimum wage or releasing a few political prisoners, it's usually done to diffuse tension or polish the regime's image. But it's not suitable for ending the dictatorship itself because it leaves the power structure intact.
Okay, so the mechanism that represents the most common success path for ending a dictatorship is number 3, nonviolent coercion. Tell us how this works.
Nonviolent coercion occurs when the opposition so fundamentally restricts the sources of power, especially human resources, skills, and material resources, that the dictator, though still adhering to their original goals and being morally unchanged,
Is rendered functionally unable to act effectively.
Exactly. The dictator still wants to rule, but cannot enforce it. The regime is paralyzed because the channels of command are broken.
And the most crucial manifestation of this is when the police or military become so unreliable that they refuse orders to repress.
Right. They cannot apply sanctions, which is the system's enforcement mechanism, if the dictator orders the capital cleared of protesters and the soldiers refuse to shoot or the police go home, the dictator has lost control. That's coercion.
And finally, number 4, the ultimate goal, disintegration.
This happens when the coercion is carried so far that the opponent's leadership loses all ability to act, and the structure of the dictatorship just collapses completely. They lack even the power to surrender or negotiate an exit.
The regime just falls to pieces, as he puts it.
Yeah, he cites East Germany in 1989 as a profound example. The East German leadership had the tanks, the weapons, the will to crush the protests, but the military chain of command dissolved beneath them. Soldiers refused orders, the bureaucracy failed to function.
And the regime simply ceased to exist.
It lacked even the means to formally declare its end. So understanding these four mechanisms is essential for strategy. You have to aim for coercion or disintegration, and then design campaigns that systematically restrict the six sources of power until that specific mechanism is activated.
Okay, let's move on to the present-day implications of this. Sharp's work isn't just descriptive history. It's a manual for building modern resistance capacity, and it emphasizes self-reliance.
Absolutely. Liberation ultimately depends on the people's ability to liberate themselves. He emphasizes there are no easy routes. Freedom requires strategic skill, hard work, discipline. And this planning operates on a spectrum, starting with the grand strategy.
And grand strategy is the overarching multi-phase plan. It coordinates all available resources, economic, human, political, communicative, to guide the conflict from the current state of dictatorship toward durable democracy.
And that last part is key. The objective must be durable democracy, not just removing the incumbent.
Because the core structure of centralized power must be dismantled.
Exactly. Then you move down to campaign strategy. These are specific, phased steps aimed at limited, attainable objectives. And these objectives must be realistically within the power capacity of the Democrats at that moment.
For example, a successful campaign might be focused solely on achieving the right for workers to hold one public meeting.
Or ensuring that independent radio broadcasts for 3 hours without jamming, something achievable.
Why is limiting the objective so crucial?
Because incremental victories are necessary to build morale and collective self-confidence. If you aim for the overthrow of the regime immediately and fail, the entire movement might become atomized again through repression.
So small, successful campaigns are the building blocks that shift the power relationship over time.
And they demonstrate to the population that the tyrant is not invincible.
And finally, the lowest level, tactics and methods. This is the operational arsenal. Sharp famously identified 198 methods across 3 categories:
Protest persuasion, non-cooperation, and intervention. And he argues that the common error is relying on only one or two, like mass strikes or simple demonstrations. He opens up a massive inventory of specific, calculated actions.
Actions designed to be confusing and difficult for the centralized regime to counter.
Exactly. For non-cooperation, you have specialized labor actions like the working to rules strike, where workers deliberately follow every single safety protocol and administrative procedure inefficiently.
Slowing critical production to a halt while remaining technically compliant.
Brilliant, isn't it? And for intervention, you have methods like parallel government. This is where the resistance movement establishes its own alternative institutions: parallel courts, parallel markets, parallel social services.
That begin to function as the de facto government in specific regions or sectors.
And the creation of these institutions is critical. It highlights the importance of what Sharp calls building democratic institutions and spaces. The structural base for democracy has to be constructed by independent civil society before or during the resistance.
These independent institutions, families, unions, religious groups, cultural associations are vital. If the dictatorship has atomized the population and destroyed them, new ones have to be created.
They are the structural centers of democratic power that prevent the new state from becoming just another dictatorship.
The example of Poland in the 1970s and 80s seems instructive here.
Oh, absolutely. Organizations like the Catholic Church, the KOR, and eventually the Solidarity Unions built structures that operated completely outside of communist control.
They provided social, economic, spiritual resources,
which left the government floating on top of society, occupying buildings and issuing decrees, but incapable of truly controlling the populace's daily life.
So the goal is achieving de facto freedom, even while the dictator is still technically in office.
He calls it escalating freedom. Initial actions should be low-risk, confidence-building tasks. As society gains strength and confidence, that freedom expands the democratic space, making the eventual collapse of the dictatorship almost inevitable.
Because the power has already fundamentally shifted.
Right. And we must also address the most sensitive and high-priority strategy, targeting the dictator's pillars, the military and police.
The institutions responsible for applying sanctions, the ultimate enforcement mechanism.
Yes.
But if the goal is nonviolent coercion, how do you strategically approach the armed forces without provoking an immediate, massive, violent crackdown?
That's the key question. And the goal is absolutely not to encourage a military coup, which, as we established, just replaces one centralized power with another. The goal is to subvert their loyalty to the regime.
not necessarily to the state or the people.
Right. The communication strategy has to be meticulous. The message is the nonviolent struggle is determined, but it is not a physical threat to the soldiers' lives or their families.
So the strategy is aimed at producing disguised disobedience.
Yes. What Sharp defines as noncompliance that is subtle and protects the actor from immediate retaliation.
This is tactical genius born of necessity.
It is. Examples include police officers carrying out instructions inefficiently, losing crucial investigative files, warning resistors of impending arrests.
Or, famously, soldiers shooting over the heads of demonstrators during a riot.
That's nonviolent coercion in action. The mechanism of enforcement is rendered unreliable, and that action cuts the dictator's capacity to apply sanctions, which is the cornerstone of their power.
Once the enforcement agents become unreliable, the whole feedback loop of fear and repression collapses.
The dictator has lost control over the very mechanism designed to make the populace compliant.
I have to ask, though, how does this 1993 framework account for the sophisticated tools of modern authoritarian control? I mean, we're not just dealing with tanks and secret police anymore. We have cyber surveillance, weaponized lawfare, algorithmic censorship.
That is a critical challenge and a fair one. Sharp's fundamental principle that power derives from consent remains true. But the tools used to manufacture and maintain that consent have evolved dramatically.
Modern authoritarianism excels at targeting the sources of power invisibly.
Exactly. Especially authority, intangible factors, and material resources. Think about the digital realm. Cyber surveillance and automated censorship are tools of atomization.
They reinforce the population's belief that they are isolated individuals.
And that restricts the intangible factor of collective self-confidence. Weaponized lawfare restricts material resources by freezing bank accounts or seizing property through dubious legal means.
So the resistance has to adapt Sharp's methods to this new landscape. Instead of striking a factory, they might strike against the state-controlled communication network.
Precisely. The focus shifts to modern forms of non-cooperation, developing parallel, encrypted communication networks, creating parallel economic systems based on cryptocurrency or barter to bypass seized banks.
Enacting digital forms of working to rule by flooding state surveillance systems with irrelevant data.
The strategy of withdrawal remains the same, but the tactics must update to target digital compliance.
This is where we can transition to the broader themes of the crisis in perception framework. Because Sharp's analysis fundamentally alters how we perceive political reality. It shifts the focus away from individuals.
It really does. His work dramatically shifts the focus from blaming evil tyrants to analyzing the systems of obedience.
The persistence of dictatorship isn't due to the dictator's personal character or exceptional wickedness,
but rather the systemic failure and weakness of the populace to collectively and strategically withhold consent.
which provides immense agency, as you pointed out. The solution isn't hoping for a benevolent leader or waiting for the tyrant to die. It lies in a systematic plan.
A grand strategy to reorganize the distribution of power. It mandates making the population and civil institutions structurally stronger and more resilient than the centralized government. It's a systems problem requiring a systems solution.
Another critical theme here is recognizing power hidden inside neutral processes. Sharp teaches us that power is not a static quantity held by the regime.
No, it's a dynamic, socially produced phenomenon that must be continually validated.
And the most crucial hidden process is legitimacy, or authority. Any act of symbolic repudiation or non-cooperation is an attack on this perceived neutrality or moral right to rule.
Right. It demonstrates that the system's power is contingent on popular belief, which makes the system vulnerable.
This is why something as simple as a mass symbolic wearing of a specific color or a moment of coordinated public silence can be so devastating to a regime.
It's an attack on the intangible factors. It reveals that the emperor has no clothes, and the population no longer believes the narrative of inevitable obedience.
That concept, that compliance and legitimacy are socially produced, is the final piece of this puzzle. Obedience is often just an instilled habit, reinforced by that feedback loop of fear.
And Sharp views political defiance as a process of education, an applied form of learning. It is the mechanism that teaches the population, through collective experience, that they can control their own behavior.
And by extension, control the supply of power to the regime.
The discipline required in nonviolent action is so crucial here. Loss of fear is achieved through disciplined action because it demonstrates collective strength and moral superiority in the face of brutality.
This is the idea of political jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
When the police beat nonviolent, disciplined resistors, the brutality rebounds politically against the dictator.
Yes. It fosters dissension in their own ranks and support for the resistance. The violence reveals the moral bankruptcy of the regime to its own enforcers. It's the systematic breakdown of the psychological barrier.
Once people realize they can act collectively without fear, the core source of the dictator's intangible power, that psychological factor inducing obedience, is destroyed.
And the stage is set for nonviolent coercion.
This has been a truly comprehensive look at the mechanics of liberation. As we wrap up this deep dive, let's just summarize the fundamental shift in perspective that Gene Sharp provides.
I think we move from viewing dictatorships as monolithic, immovable objects sustained by brute force
To understanding them as highly fragile systems, perpetually dependent on cooperation. They are held together primarily by an illusion of strength and the population's collective fear.
both of which can be strategically dismantled through organized political defiance.
And why this perspective matters is because it provides agency. The conclusion is a hard one, but it's profoundly empowering.
It is. Liberation from dictatorships ultimately depends on the people's ability to liberate themselves. There are no easy routes. Freedom requires strategic skill, discipline, and hard work, often at great cost.
But the path, built on systems analysis, is clear. The ultimate lesson is that political power is not permanent and not inherent in the ruler. It is transient and always derived from the strategic cooperation or withdrawal of cooperation of the ruled.
And this brings us to a final provocative thought that Sharp really emphasizes. The democratic revolution only begins with the fall of the dictator. He stresses the need for advanced planning to prevent the rise of a new tyranny.
Because, as Aristotle warned centuries ago, tyranny can also change into tyranny.
So, after achieving success through massive political defiance, what must a newly liberated society do to ensure its lasting defense against future threats, both foreign and domestic? Sharp suggests considering a concept called civilian-based defense, or CBD.
Applying the core principles of political defiance to national security itself.
Exactly. This goes beyond just securing the political process. It means structurally decentralizing the capacity for defense. So instead of relying on a large professional military, which often creates the very centralized power structure that could threaten democracy, CBD institutionalizes defense capacity directly in the hands of the citizenry.
And the civil institutions.
Right. It means civil society is trained to defend infrastructure, communication, borders, and governance nonviolently through pre-planned, systematic non-cooperation and resistance protocols.
This ensures that even if a foreign power invades or an internal clique attempts a coup, they cannot successfully govern.
Because the population is structurally incapable of being ruled against its will.
Which raises the essential question for you, the listener, the system thinker. How do the new systems we build after liberation secure the very freedoms we fought so hard to obtain, ensuring that the power remains fundamentally distributed and never again centralized in the hands of a few? This deep dive was based on the concepts presented in Town, From Dictatorship to Democracy, a conceptual framework for liberation by Gene Sharp. We encourage you to read the book yourselves, to engage with the full analysis and support the author if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.